Ever feel like you're stuck between a rock and a hard place? Well, that's kind of what it was like for the UK in Basra back in, say, 2007, 2008. The US was all about the surge, sending in thousands of troops. But the UK, they were trying to figure out how to make a graceful exit. You were really curious about this whole balancing act, weren't you? Luckily, we've got these declassified UK government documents from the Chilcot inquiry to shed some light on things.
It's a real head-scratcher, isn't it? The UK is trying to plan their exit, but they're also under pressure to keep things from falling apart, especially with the US taking such a different approach.
Yeah, it's like trying to sneak out of a party unnoticed while someone's setting off fireworks in the backyard. But like you mentioned before, it's important to remember that Basra wasn't Baghdad. They were dealing with different challenges, right?
Totally. While Baghdad was consumed by sectarian violence, the UK had a whole different beast to contend with in Basra. Think more along the lines of a messy web of militias, each with their own agenda. And then try balancing that with the Iraqi government wanting to assert its control, plus the ever-present influence of Iran. It was a delicate situation, to say the least.
Okay, let's untangle this web a bit, shall we? You were particularly intrigued by the UK's dealings with these militias, especially the Mahdi Army, also known as JAM.
Rightfully so. This is where things get really interesting. The documents show that the UK actually tried to negotiate with JAM, even though they had serious reservations internally.
Hold on, they were negotiating with a group known for violence. That sounds incredibly risky. What was the strategy there?
It was a gamble for sure, but a calculated one. Their primary goal was to create a window of opportunity for a stable Iraqi government to take root. They were desperate to reduce the violence, and negotiating with JAM, even a group like that, was seen as the most direct path. There's even talk in the documents about potential ceasefires and prisoner releases in exchange for some semblance of peace on the ground.
I can see how that would be a tough pill to swallow for some. Did they actually make any headway with these negotiations? Did it actually lead to any stability?
There were moments, periods of reduced violence that seemed promising, but it was always precarious, like a house of cards. Even some UK military leaders voiced their concerns, and you can see it in their reports. They questioned whether negotiating with JAM would truly lead to lasting peace.
So a lot of one step forward, two steps back then, and all while trying to keep both the US, who weren't too keen on coddling JAM, and the Iraqi government, eager to take control, happy. It sounds like a recipe for disaster.
That's the question, isn't it? You were really interested in understanding provincial Iraqi control, weren't you? This basically meant handing over security control to the Iraqi government, a huge step towards the UK's eventual withdrawal. But the path to PIC was full of obstacles, and there were definitely differing opinions on when Basra would truly be ready. The UK seemed more optimistic about a faster handover than the US, or even some within the Iraqi government.
Yeah, that sounds like a recipe for some serious disagreements. But the handover of Basra Palace to Iraqi control did happen in September 2007. That had to be seen as a major win on the road to PIC, right?
Well, it was a big deal, no doubt. But like a lot of things in this situation, it wasn't as simple as it seemed. The actual handover went smoothly from a military standpoint. But, beneath the surface, some cracks were starting to show. This event really highlighted the growing gap between how the UK and the US saw the situation on the ground.
So a bit of a lost in translation moment between allies.
Exactly. The UK saw it as this big step in their exit strategy. But some in the US military, especially those on the ground, weren't so comfortable. They worried the UK was creating a vacuum, leaving the door wide open for Iran to step in. And we're not just talking rumors here. There are reports from high-ranking U.S. officials expressing deep concerns about the UK's withdrawal pace and what it could mean for the region.
So even though the UK was trying to present the handover as a victory, there was this feeling, at least from some corners, that they were cutting and running, just leaving Basra to fend for itself.
That's the perception that started to take hold, yeah. And this difference of opinion, along with the ever-present security worries, created a lot of tension. Which leads us to a pivotal moment, a real turning point. March 2008 and the Iraqi-led Charge of the Nights operation. This event really threw a wrench into the works and showed just how fragile the UK's plans were.
From what we've seen so far, fragile seems to be a recurring theme here. But before we jump into the Charge of the Nights and all that unfolded, let's just take a second to appreciate how difficult the UK's position was.
Absolutely. It's like juggling chainsaws while walking a tightrope. That's what it was like for the UK and Basra. They were trying to balance their own desire to exit gracefully with the need to establish stability, all while managing the expectations of their Iraqi partners and their U.S. allies. And as you'll see, the Charge of the Nights really brought these competing priorities into sharp focus.
Okay, so the UK is carefully prepping for their exit, trying to handle this delicate situation with the militias. And then, bam, the Iraqi government launches a major offensive out of the blue. Talk about a curveball. This Charge of the Knights operation, what happened? What was the immediate fallout?
Well, chaos is a good word for it. The documents from this time really show how, maybe not betrayed, but definitely frustrated the UK was. They saw this sudden move as a sign that the Iraqi government, maybe feeling bold after the U.S. surge and more sure of themselves, was ready to take charge, even if it meant leaving their UK partners behind.
And on the ground, all this sudden violence popping up, how'd that impact the UK's mission, especially their whole plan of a smooth handover to Iraqi control?
It threw a wrench in things, that's for sure. The UK was stuck trying to support their Iraqi partners while also managing their own withdrawal, all while fighting was flaring up again, and nobody was sure what had happened next. Remember, they had already handed over Basra Palace and were hoping to reduce their troops even more. This Charge of the Knights operation made everyone wonder if a full handover was even possible anytime soon.
You were particularly interested in how the UK dealt with the Mahdi army during this time, right? And this is where things get even more complicated, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. Part of the point of the Charge of the Knights was to reduce Jam's influence in Basra, but it also ended up splitting the group up, which created these smaller, even less predictable factions, often with secret ties to Iran. The UK suddenly had a whole new set of security problems to deal with.
So it's 2008, things are even more dangerous than before, and the Iraqi government just went off script with this big offensive. What did the UK do? Did they just give up and say, good luck with that?
Not exactly. Even with all the problems and frustrations, the UK was still really invested in a stable and secure Iraq. They couldn't just walk away, not with their reputation and the region's future on the line. Instead, they doubled down on supporting the Iraqi security forces. More training, more equipment, even some direct military help when asked.
Sounds like some tough love for their Iraqi partners, like, we're still here, but we're not doing this for you.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The focus shifted from direct combat to a hands-off approach, training, mentoring, sharing intelligence. They also started pulling troops back from the riskiest parts of Basra City, consolidating their presence at the more secure Basra Air Station.
A strategic retreat, in a way. Less about boots on the ground, more about providing support from afar.
Precisely. And this wasn't just about keeping UK forces safer. It was also about sending a message to the Iraqi government, to the militias, to everyone in the region, that the UK was committed to a responsible drawdown, but they were not going to be dragged back into a full-blown war.
But all this moving around and repositioning doesn't change the big issue, does it? The Charge of the Knights had to have put a real strain on the UK's relationship with the Iraqi government. How did they deal with that diplomatic mess?
It was tricky, no doubt. The documents show a real lack of trust on both sides. The Iraqi government felt like the UK's earlier attempts to negotiate with Jam made them look weak and disrespected their authority. Meanwhile, the UK was, to put it mildly, frustrated by the lack of communication and the chaotic way the Charge of the Knights was handled.
So how do you fix things after something like that?
It took time, diplomacy, and a good dose of being practical on both sides. They eventually reached an understanding. They realized that even with their disagreements, they still needed each other. The UK, even though they wanted to leave smoothly, knew that if Iraq completely fell apart, it would be disastrous. And the Iraqi government, even though they wanted to be independent, still really relied on UK support.
A classic case of, we need to talk, but we also kind of need each other.
That's it. But even though they were trying to smooth things over, there was this feeling that their relationship had changed. The Charge of the Knights, whether it was meant to or not, was a turning point. The UK was still a player in Iraq, but their role was shrinking, and the Iraqi government was getting more and more comfortable making their own decisions.
It really makes you think about the unintended consequences of actions, even those taken with the best of intentions, huh?
Definitely. And that's one of the things that makes this whole period so interesting to unpack. We see how even the most carefully made plans can be completely thrown off by what happens on the ground, by alliances changing, by miscalculations and miscommunications. And in this case, the stakes were incredibly high. We're talking about the future of a country, the stability of a whole region.
And as you said at the beginning when you asked for this deep dive, you're really interested in understanding what the UK's presence in Basra means in the long run, both for the region and for the UK's own foreign policy.
And that's exactly what we'll dig into next. We've seen how the UK ended up in this situation, how they tried to manage a complicated and ever-changing landscape. But the question still remains, what did they ultimately leave behind?
So we've seen the UK dealing with this incredibly complicated situation in Basra. They were trying to pull out while also trying to make sure things wouldn't fall apart completely. But history doesn't always play nice with those kinds of plans, does it? When all is said and done, what did the UK actually accomplish in Basra? Did they really leave things better than they found them?
That's the million-dollar question, right? The one that keeps historians up at night. And, the Chilcot inquiry, with all its issues, does give us some interesting insights into how the UK saw its own role, how they tried to come to terms with what they did in Basra. And let me tell you, some of those assessments are surprisingly frank.
Don't hold back, give it to us straight. What did they get right and where did they fall short?
Well, one of the UK's big goals in Basra, of course, was to help establish a stable and functioning government. They put a ton of resources into training Iraqi security forces, tried to build up local institutions, and invested heavily in economic development. And early on, there were some signs of progress. Some of their efforts, especially when it came to basic services and infrastructure, seemed promising.
But those signs of progress, I'm guessing, didn't always last.
Unfortunately, no. The inquiry found that while the UK's heart was in the right place, their efforts were often undermined by things outside their control. There was deep-rooted corruption within the Iraqi government and security forces, political infighting that stalled any real progress, and a chronic inability to follow through on agreed-upon initiatives. It was like trying to push a boulder uphill, a constant struggle.
The classic two steps forward, one step back scenario.
Exactly. And then, of course, the Charge of the Knights threw everything into disarray. It wasn't just the violence that set them back. It was the realization that the Iraqi government, for better or worse, was ready to make its own decisions, even if it meant clashing with their allies.
We always hear about the fog of war, but it seems like there was a fog of peace, too. This uncertainty about how to go from a military presence to a lasting, peaceful future.
That's a great way to put it. And it wasn't just the big picture stuff either. You were particularly interested in the human cost of all of this, and rightly so. The Chilcot inquiry documents, while they don't go into a lot of detail about the experiences of ordinary Iraqis, do paint a stark picture of a city devastated by years of violence, poverty, and a lack of basic necessities.
Basra, in many ways, became a microcosm of the larger tragedy in Iraq. A stark reminder that even wars fought with the best of intentions have unintended consequences.
Absolutely. And those consequences are often felt most acutely by the people who had the least to do with starting the conflict. It's impossible to put a number on the full human cost of any war, but the Chilcot inquiry serves as a powerful reminder that it's often the civilians who continue to suffer long after the troops have gone home.
We've covered a lot in this deep dive. We've explored the UK's role in Basra from those early hopeful days to their eventual and somewhat messy withdrawal. We've seen how they tried to handle changing alliances, internal disagreements, and that constant tension between wanting to leave but also wanting to leave behind a stable Iraq. So what's the bottom line? What can we learn from all of this, both for future interventions and for understanding our complicated world?
It's a cautionary tale, no doubt. The UK's experience in Basra shows us that military interventions, even those started with the best intentions, are risky. They're messy, unpredictable, and rarely go as planned. Building a lasting peace, as we've seen, takes a lot more than just military strength. It takes a deep understanding of the local situation, a willingness to be in it for the long haul, and a recognition that even the best plans are only as good as the commitment behind them.
And maybe most importantly, it means being willing to really listen to and learn from the people who are most affected by what we do, the people who call these places home long after we've moved on. That's something we all need to remember, no matter what our political views are.
I couldn't agree more.
Well said. As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with one final thought, something to think about as you continue to learn about this complicated and often difficult period in history. The UK's time in Basra reminds us that the true cost of war isn't always measured in casualties or money spent, but in the lasting impact it has on the very soul of a society. The scars of conflict, as we've seen, can last for generations, shaping politics, economies, and the human spirit long after the fighting is over.